Okay. Ladies and gentlemen. Hello, hello. How'd it go with the homework?
8.
Oh, yeah, you. Yeah. How did you do the 8-9 hours? That was amazing.
Have you looked into my report?
I did not. No.
Okay.
Yeah. What time did you finish it?
5:30. 5:30 today.
2 a.m.
Yeah.
So I basically had a few hours to look at it. No, I saw it this morning at breakfast, and that's the last time I looked at it. How about you guys? How did it go with the homework? Who didn't get to it at all? How come? Oh, okay. Who else didn't get to it at all? Yes? Burke?
Struggling to do this.
Uh-huh. David, how did you do on it?
David.
What?
How did you do
On the homework. So I did the Facebook API,
Uh-huh.
and so for our app, we already had an app that we were linking to.
Yeah.
So I took the key from that, which was this ID, a YouTube video told me how to do that.
Yeah.
And then I did that, and then I did get and got stuff. And it worked.
So okay, good. So you got it to work, great. So, so I gave you a bunch of different APIs that I thought were kind of interesting, but not that there were any that were particularly special or important to us. Just that they were. I wanted to get your mind thinking about it. The basic concept of a web service or a web API or whatever, those terms are sometimes used interchangeably, is in a way simple. You can ask Yahoo for a stock price or ask the weather service for temperature. But I want to try to give you guys a broader way to look at it so that you can apply it in more general and more interesting ways on both sides of the coin. So I'm going to sort of go back to a little bit of first or second or third principles to explain, at least for me, why the notion of web services, when I first came across it, was really, really exciting. The possibilities were really, really exciting. So up to now, I've said to you that the job of a web server is to do what? What is the? You send it a request and it sends you
The response.
what's in the response. What format is it? That is a trick question. HTML.
Yeah.
Right. So everybody's used. You can type in the URL, you get HTML back. And the basic insight that somebody had, because it was not immediately obvious, was that a web server actually could return other things than just HTML, right? So let's imagine that you are the Teachback team, and you decide that you want to automatically populate your classes and your courses with information from other colleges around. And you say, awesome, I'm going to go to the Olin College website, and I find that all their courses are online. And you want to incorporate these into your application. You want to sort of prime the pump, so when you try to sell your product to Olin College, all those courses are there, and the professor's going to be awesome, my course is there, you can start teaching it. How would you go about doing that? What would you do? How would you go about pulling this stuff into your app? Anybody? Evan, any ideas? No clue? I'm going to give you $1 million to do it. Come on.
Specific. I mean, there are like crons that pull things from existing web pages and parse them. I couldn't give you specific details.
Sorry, I had to talk whispering. Go ahead.
I've never written a cron. I don't really
Yeah.
know. I mean,
What would the cron do?
It would just fetch the page
Yeah.
into a readable format.
Yeah. What format would you get the page from the server from? In what format would you get the page from the service?
HTML.
Yeah, and how would you then go about figuring out, that the course number is 2125, or that the professor is, it's not even here, but whatever. The prerequisites, how would you go about figuring that out? Yes?
Could you parse that into like a JSON or XML?
Yeah, you would parse it. And what's the problem with parsing? What's the drawback? Well, it's tricky.
Processing?
Yeah, it's tricky.
Do it.
Yeah, well, they have to be extreme. You have to do it, but they have to be extremely rigorous and consistent in the way they label everything. Now, probably it's coming out of a database. We're not sure.
It's pretty consistent here.
Yeah, they are. No, I agree. But in a general case, you'd have to be worried about that. So that's kind of, for me, that is the problem in a way that web services started to try to solve, which is to say, realize that all the wonderful information that's inside of a web server in the database may be useful to other things other than people. And how do I make that available to other things other than people? And that's kind of where it came from. So let me just quickly show you an example to sort of drive home the point for those of you who are not quite seeing it. If I do give this command, so I do a curl command, and a curl command, okay guys, enough coding, let's pay attention. The curl command is basically grabs HTTP and returns it, and the little angle bracket there does what? Pardon?
Puts it in the file.
Puts it in the file, exactly. Okay, so that's boom. And there it is, grab the file, and now I can go subl the file. And there it is, and now I can go parse it. And it's a darn long file, and it's got a lot of noise in it. So yes, you can find an HTML parsing package like Nokogiri, and this is also like XML. And if you're lucky, you'll get it to work. And if you're unlucky, the next semester it'll all break, right? Which is not unlikely. Okay, so by the way, this term is called scraping. We're talking about scraping web pages, and notice that sometimes there's issues with that. For example, is it okay for you to write a program to scrape Olin's website for courses? Or is it not?
It's not.
Is it what?
Not illegal.
Am I speaking too fast? Is it okay for you to write a program that scrapes the course information off of Olin's site? And if not, in what way is it not? What can happen? Who are you insulting? Yes?
Well, if you're just like scraping like the kind of like the raw page and then using like some sort of string parser to
Yeah.
parse it, that's like if they change something, then your whole like parser's broken.
Correct.
So like the best way to do it is like to get it directly to the database or API or something. But if you don't, I don't think you have like we would have access to that if we were working something like that.
Right,
So
right.
we'd
Speak
have
up a little bit though, so we can get you
so
on the.
we'd have to
Yeah.
use some sort of like string parser.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so yeah, there's that. There's Ruby. In fact, maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that really briefly. But there's Ruby code that facilitates parsing this stuff. Yes, George.
I think there could also be like legitimate reasons
Yeah.
or like issues. For example, basically for now the whole value of WebCreator would be the data.
Yeah.
And if someone else writes a scraper for that and just downloads all the data that we
You might not be so happy with that.
yeah.
In fact, there are definitely businesses out there. I know of one particularly, a friend of mine who started a company, where the app he built and the site he built, all that was no big deal, but he developed a data set of, get this, of all highway exits in the US mapped to restaurants and other activities that are available at that exit with a distinction between if you're going northbound or southbound. So nobody else had that data. If I'm on Route 90 going east and I come to exit 41, there's a McDonald's there. People know that there's McDonald's geographically near that exit, but they don't know what direction. So he built that database painstakingly by hand. And when it was all said and done, that was the asset he had that was the most important. And the same exact thing can happen with VaporAir. Yeah. I saw some other hands. Yes?
So I actually opened the robots.txt file for them.
Yeah.
And they don't disallow it for robots to.
What does the robots.txt do you think?
So it's supposed to like technically block off any kind of automated response to accessing a particular page on the website. So it lists like there's actually a big list of things you can access. For example, their admin console on the back end, and there's so many other ones for searching user password, whatever it is. But I remember doing it for Brandeis earlier, and Brandeis does block off the scheduler.
Yeah.
But Olin doesn't, so I feel like it wouldn't be allowed to do it for Brandeis.
You wouldn't be able to do it for, well, you probably could, yes.
You
Go ahead,
probably
yes.
could figure out the time.
Counterpoint.
Yeah.
I thought it's not actually a counterpoint to that. I just thought I would mention something kind of cool that happened to me last summer.
Yeah.
I was working as a web developer, and I was working on a project where these people wanted to build a website where you could view historical weather information.
Yes,
And like graph it and plot it against years and stuff.
Yep.
So we used Forecast.io. I don't know if anyone knows that.
No.
They have a really, really good API, and they you can do like thousands of requests for really, really cheap. And we asked
For
them-
weather forecasts.
For forecasts and also historical data.
Cool.
going back
I didn't know that one.
Going back to the Unix epic, I think. And the thing that was really cool is we asked them, would it be okay if we stored some of your data? And they said, yeah, absolutely, because that'll take the load off our servers.
Yep, that's very interesting. Because you'll find sometimes just the opposite, which is permitted to get the data, but you're not permitted to store it. Robots.txt actually, because while you're there, look at the Olin site to see whether you can find a copyright notice anywhere. Yes?
I think the robot.txt,
Yeah.
it cannot technically spell anything. It's just a convention in the industry. So if you do not stick to the convention, you can fetch data as you want. It's just a convention. It's not the real technical stuff.
Yeah, actually, I think robots.txt had its origin and probably still is only meant for preventing search engines from crawling for the purposes of updating their search engine databases, because what people found was that their servers were getting a lot of load simply because Google kept checking to see whether there was anything to index. So I believe that robots.txt, which is just a text file that sits at a well-known URL that you can just get with HTTP, is meant to tell robots visiting the Olin site what pages they don't want to be indexed into Google. It's not the same as a legal authorization to use it. And I'm going to guess, but I don't know this for a fact, that, hey, where's my caffeine? It's because the window's so small I can't see it. Help me! Okay, whatever. That they probably have a problem with you downloading their schedule information for commercial purposes. I don't know for a fact, but almost everybody has that. So scraping, while everybody does it, often violates the law. Now let's talk about real briefly as a quick side point. We're all good members of the Rambus community. We don't violate any laws, correct? So my question to you is, if you're faced with a project, he smiled. If you're faced with a project that requires scraping, how do you think through that? Other than saying, well, I can't break any rules. Well, that's not true. If I want to make a one-line program demonstration, I'm going to scrape. I'm not going to worry about it. How do you think through that? How do you decide whether to do it or not? What are some of the things you would think of?
I think one of the main issues is whether or not you're making money.
Commercial?
Yeah.
It's a commercial enterprise, yeah.
Just from lots of things, I've seen lots of products. They're like, hey, feel free to use our product non-commercially, with our free license or whatever.
Yeah. So it is, whether it's commercial or not is a major consideration, yes.
The availability of the data, like if it's weather data or something,
you
could get weather data from anywhere, and no one could prove that was, if it's for the weather forecast, everyone makes a weather forecast. It's not necessarily a unique thing. But if it's course data from one university, that's clearly taken from that university.
I mean, you could argue that weather data is very expensive to collect and so on and so forth, but I think that the angle I would take your point is more.
I was thinking about from a getting caught perspective.
Oh, from a getting caught perspective, yeah. Because I was going to say, do you have a reasonable belief that the company thinks it's very proprietary? That they have a reasonable belief that the company would be protective of it? I would be surprised. I am kind of surprised that, for example, course data at Brandeis is considered to be a no-no to grab. But from their point of view, from what I hear, if you build an app that helps me select courses, and that app somehow confuses students because the data is actually wrong or out of date and causes all kinds of administrative problems, they could say, well, we'd rather be the official place to get course data.
I heard about that there were really issues because in Rick's class, I think last semester, or the semester before, some group developed a very cool, very helpful system for course selections and proposed it to Brandeis, and they rejected it because of
something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets very political very quickly. Or political is the wrong word, but there's non-technical considerations that come into play often that may not be immediately obvious if you think about it, but you can understand their perspective as well. Anyway, now, so if you're building a service where actually you want people not to scrape your site and you believe that you have some data that's useful, then of course you might be motivated to create a web service, right? So let's think about that. But let me be a little bit grandiose for a second and say that if you think about the internet quote unquote, with all its services, and think of them not as delivering web pages, but delivering APIs. And you can imagine the whole internet like a big operating system. And applications no longer are applications. They are interesting combinations of different services, and each server is providing a part of the operating system. Who's heard of an app or a website called If This Then That? Can you explain it, Miranda, for the people who haven't?
No.
Okay, then you've heard of it. Okay, let me take it back. Who can explain this website called If This Then That? Yes?
So basically it has, you can like sign in with a bunch of things.
Yeah.
Like Evernote and like Google Reader and the weather. And so
Yeah.
basically if something online triggers something, then it does something else.
Okay. So anybody want to add to that? Yes, George.
Yes, so yes. Basically, like two types of they call it channels. I
Yep.
think. So they have two types of channels, some which are constantly monitored, and like as I said, and observed for changes, and some where you can actually, in our terms, post something. Means some email, some text message, some phone call, something. So something that can be triggered and then executed. So whenever someone uploads some new photo on Facebook, it can be automatically stored in my Dropbox,
Right.
or I can get a text message about it.
So like that's the ultimate, not the ultimate, but that is a beautiful instantiation of the idea of the internet as a big operating system. Because each of those endpoints, whether they're the sensing ones or the acting ones, are web services of some kind. The term web service is very general, and web API is very general. I'm going to describe how you do it with REST and HTTP, but you can legitimately call, if you have data that doesn't change at all, like the GDP historical data over the 20th century, then there's nothing wrong with saying I have an API that delivers a comma delimited file in a certain directory. You grab it with FTP. I would call that a web service as well. The data doesn't change. If the data changes a lot, you want something live. But the idea of the internet as a big operating system with all these services, and you being able to write apps that use these services, I think is a very powerful one. I was very, it triggered my imagination when I first heard somebody describe it that way. Okay, so now let's get a little bit more geeky. So whenever I want to get information from one computer to another, I'm talking over the network. And as we've seen, when you talk over the network, you have protocols. So there has been an evolution of protocols that are used for this. And in general, George, and yes, in general, the notion, the way you can think about it is the protocol in this context is something that allows me to essentially write a subroutine in one computer to call a subroutine on another computer. That's kind of what it is. So it's like okay. No. It's like weather.com. I'm calling get temperature at Arlington. It just happens that this call is implemented on another server, and the person making the call is written on my server. Now, there are some very fundamental differences, obviously technically, about how this is implemented, but you can think of it as a subroutine call. And the question is, how do you get a subroutine call from one computer to another? Well, you have to have some network. You have to have some network, you have to have some protocols. And you will hear mentioned these three that I have here. XML-RPC was basically, the word RPC stands for remote procedure call. And XML-RPC was a variant of a remote procedure call. This would be a remote procedure call that went over XML, that formatted the information over XML. SOAP is very famous and very maligned. It's an extraordinarily complex way of doing this. The standards are hundreds and hundreds of pages long, and people generally, people in the hacker community definitely, are cynical about it, although it's still being used plenty in the business world. And then the one we're most interested in is called REST. And the paper that you guys read was the origin of the term REST, the famous Fielding paper. It's pretty complicated, as you guys saw. But it was very influential. It was influential, and yet there's plenty of people that spend their life debating as to whether this is good REST or that's bad REST or how you can improve REST. So don't get super caught up in those debates. Just think about the fact that the characteristics of REST are that you're calling it through a URL, and that something about the URL tells you something about the parameters you're supplying as the caller, right? And that the return value generally is either XML or JSON. And that's obviously a very incomplete definition of REST, but those are sort of the things that you recognize. As you saw, and you've looked, those of you who called the Yahoo API for stock prices, sometimes and often you find a gem or something that helps you get through there. So my question is that helps you call the API. So my question is, what are some of the trade-offs? How is calling a method in your own code different? What are some of the things that are different technically that you would have to pay attention to versus calling a method that's actually somewhere else? Anybody? Yes, George.
Well, you don't have the might control over the function you're calling.
Right.
So in your own code,
Yep.
whenever you know if something changes.
Right.
Or at least if you're working in a team, then you get an update
Yep.
from GitHub.
Yep. Exactly.
On another one, they can change it without letting you know.
And that's a real
Because
problem.
they don't even know what they're
Yep.
using.
Exactly. Any other big differences, David?
I don't know.
Take a stab.
The difference, I guess, is that they could also get mad. I don't know. The difference between calling the method in
Technically, what do you have to pay attention to? What do you have to think about? How can the call be different? What are the technical considerations that would be different? Nothing? Got nothing? Yes.
The processing time. Like it takes
Yes.
time to actually get the request.
Yes. Right. Latency, they call that.
Yeah.
Big deal. Latency. Okay. Very good. Anybody else? Yeah, you had your hand. No?
I was basically thinking the same thing.
Yeah. And with latency comes, yes, William.
If some things change that matter, like what is returned, if the format is changed.
I'm sorry, what it returns? In other words, if the API changes, your expectations are wrong. You didn't write it. Right, exactly. That's kind of what George said as well. George?
General availability, if the server's down.
Yes.
It's not a latency anymore, it's just
Right.
not working.
Yeah, exactly. And with latency comes, of course, the ultimate latent is the timeout. It can actually just fail. It may be down or it may be delayed so long, so you have to have the error handling is quite different. One of the things that happens when you design an API, and I'll talk about this a little bit, is that if it's an API that's going to be called over the web, if it's a web API or web service API, you tend to want to have calls that are fewer and do more. So if you want to populate your teachback screen that has a pie chart and a graph, you don't want to have a call for every point on the graph. It would be fine if it was calling your own code, but if it's calling across the net, you want to have a big thing that says, give me all the data from the graph. So the granularity of the calls would be different. You would design them differently in that respect. Okay. Now here's another thing that's pretty interesting. Traditionally, and all you guys are building mobile access to your apps by using something like Bootstrap and making the screen smaller and so on and so forth, making the page responsive to a smaller screen, and that's fine. The way people are doing more and more building mobile apps these days, the technological trend, is to actually have the server not deliver any HTML at all. Okay, to have the server be a big ball of web services, and have the client, the web page, be written with JavaScript to grab what it's needed to draw the picture, to draw the display. And of course, there are very elaborate JavaScript frameworks, a la Rails, except they're called other things like Angular, and there's several others. What?
Backbone.
And Backbone, and the big one is Ember. They're extraordinarily complicated, but one of the relevance here is that the server becomes, as much as anything, a deliverer of a whole bunch of web services. Let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, think about, I'm trying to get you guys into sort of a design architecture mindset. How would that, what does that change? I mean, if you have to build, what's going on? Let's talk about what's going on. Tell me about what's going on's mobile architecture the way it is today. There is none, right? It's basically a bootstrap that gets smaller, right? Or is there one? Well, how do the points get updated?
Oh, so right now, like when you just refresh the page, it like calls we look at what Rails for loop that goes to the database and puts it into the JavaScript. But now we're adding a feature where it like updates automatically every some amount of minutes. And so what we're gonna do with that is we're gonna have like I'm gonna write like an Ajax thing that pulls the data from like another dynamically generated like Rails page.
And it's delivering HTML back.
Delivers HTML back.
Yeah. So you could. So there. That's interesting. Ajax, we'll talk about that on Friday. But there, they have a essentially a controller action, which is generating a snippet of HTML, which gets stuck in the appropriate place in the page. But you could take it the next level and say, oh, instead of that, it's going to send a bunch of JSON, and then you write JavaScript on the client to build up that HTML. The interesting thing there is that now you've decoupled the thing totally. Now the server just needs to know how to send the points back in a generic sense. And now you would have a web service. And if you can just imagine multiplying that to your whole UI, that's kind of the way mobile apps are being architected more and more, yes.
I think this idea is extremely used in Google Web Toolkit.
Yep.
Where you, like I played around with it, and it's an awesome thing where you can just write plain Java code and it translates it into JavaScript. And this is all that you see. And all the data you do with a no procedure calls and it returns to your objects.
Right. Exactly. Was there another comment? Okay. So yes.
I think use JavaScript to draw the HTML element. There's some performance concerns because JavaScript on the browser is single thread. But HTTP response could be multi-thread, so you can load the test in one thread and load the feature in another thread. So, but if you use JavaScript to do this stuff, it can only be executed in a single thread, and if one is blocked, the others could be.
Yep. Oh, by the way, yes.
Also for search engines, of course. It's a big deal if you use JavaScript, for example, for WebRaider, using JavaScript would be very bad. Because we would live from the average, like if Google finds some interesting products on our site, we would link to that. This would bring the money to our product.
No, that's fair.
If we use JavaScript, then Google can't.
And there's nothing for the search engine to localize. Of course, if you have a big database like VaporRaider, then it's not going to. All those pages don't exist to be searched anyway, right? They get created on the fly.
If we use REST URLs,
it doesn't know how to create them. Google doesn't know how to do that. Google can only crawl from the beginning to the bottom, top to the bottom. It's not going to feed. It's like Google does not search and give me all flights that are listed on Kayak. Does it? No, it doesn't. That's a lot of flights. Now, some people will provide a special interface and have a special deal with Google where they actually provide a web service. So when there's like baseball scores and stuff like that, or weather reports, that's how they're doing it. But that's not crawling. But it's still a reasonable point. I mean, if your website just returns static JavaScript code which then gets executed, then that's not going to get indexed, and that's a legitimate concern.
I don't like that, right? If for example, we have the overview of all our items, or some, so we say webradar.com/items, and we see all the items, and these items have links. And there is some website.
But the /items, for example, is just the first page. So you basically have Google clicking on the next, and getting more and more pages.
It's a link.
I don't. It's a good point, but I don't. I don't have a good answer for you, to be honest. I don't think it's the case, though. I don't think that maybe the fact that you have a all items listing, which Kayak doesn't have, or Amazon doesn't have, makes a difference. You're right. I'd have to think about it. I mean, Kayak. If you go to kayak.com, you don't see all flights. You have to type in a query, and that's where my point really is strong. Okay. All right. The other things, of course, are so I want to talk a little bit about the gems. In general, it's very nice to know these APIs, and it's very nice to be able to interpret the web pages that describe these APIs, like you guys did as preparation for this class. by studying the documentation. However, in practice, what you want to do very, very quickly is to create a layer of abstraction. What do I mean by a layer of abstraction in this context? Oh, yes?
I mean, isn't it kind of like what you said there, where it's just you say get temperature, and not, you know, oh, keyword, blah, 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 key ID, all this stuff, you know, just get temperature.
Yeah. And what are the pros and cons to creating your own layer of abstraction?
Pros would be like you save a lot of time. If you have that layer, you can just call the methods.
Yep.
And then, you know, you can keep on building it.
So, you know, exactly. Yes, go ahead.
If they ever do change anything,
yep,
it's localized where you have to fix.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the idea of information hiding, of localizing expertise in one place. Yeah.
Also in the same direction, they can even like if the rest of the application relies that this interface works and this abstraction works, then you can expand services, exchange services.
Exchange services, exactly.
If one server is down, you can take another one, or you can decide to completely move to another service. So it's just, and do completely different API calls, but internally transfer it to the objects that the rest of your application expects.
Exactly right. So there's obviously that's a big advantage to be able to switch around. The other thing you can do when you create an abstraction is to do caching. Okay, who can explain to me what caching would mean in this context? Somebody from this side.
Like caching is used to like store data.
So caching, not money caching. C-A-C-H-E. Yeah. But think through a scenario. How about trade guys? What would caching mean in this context? Trade assistant guys. Anybody? Yes.
Storing recent calls locally so you wouldn't have to fetch them again.
Yeah, and what are the advantages of that?
Much faster, and it means fewer requests.
Yep. And those are correct. And a +1 on the fewer requests is sometimes the service throttles how many requests you're allowed to do. One of the problems with doing that, not the problems, but one of the things you have to deal with, yes?
If it's something that changes often, like for instance stocks or something, you have to, you don't want to be caching it for like a week or something. They'll think, oh, it never changes. It has.
So cache expiration is, of course, a fundamental element of the idea of caching in general, which is like how long is the information good for? You looked like you were going to put your hand up, or was it just your bucket? Okay. So, a couple of more things about caching that's interesting to think about. Oftentimes, the API key you get is personal, right? It's my API key. If you build a service, let's say a trade assistant, that requires an API key to operate, and they have 1 million users, there's going to be one of a few problems. Either their server is going to exceed the threshold that they're allowed to make calls, the API calls, 1. 2, they're going to have to pay a whole lot of money. 3, potentially, in some cases, the license doesn't even permit the data to be stored, so that actually all they're allowed to do is to pass it on. So you have a few considerations from the point of view of licensing and legal stuff, as well as architecture to think about when you cache. And one of them has to do with the API key. So some products solve this. That's unusual. The general way to solve it is you probably have to get permission from the data owner saying you want to, they call syndicate. You want to essentially re-offer the data to more than one person, in which case they might give you a special higher price. You might decide to ask the individual end users to get their own key and type it in. So just go to weather.com and get the login over there. And when you want to use our app, give us it, and they will pass it through, and the server will operate on their behalf. So there's a number of ways of dealing with it. The caching absolutely comes into play whenever you do this kind of thing. I want to throw in one other little technical detail, which is if you think about it, it's not so obvious where you cache stuff on a Rails server. Why? Because as I've told you, with every request, all your controller state gets thrown out and starts over. The session gets reconstructed, but everything else gets thrown out. And so that's something you have to look at closely. Do you do caching in the database so that it survives, in which case when you cache you're always accessing the database, or how do you do it? Now that's a whole other lecture, but I just wanted to point out that it's not so obvious. You don't just create a little array of values in a controller, because that thing is not going to be there when you come back the next request. It turns out that I'd stumbled across in Rails 4, there actually is a cache class specifically to give you an abstraction layer around caching. So when you guys get to that, we'll talk about the cache class. But those are some of the issues. But caching definitely comes into play. Now another big issue with these gems that you can find is, are they up to date? Are they being maintained? And do they actually insulate you so much from what's actually going on that maybe they only give you 1/10 of the functionality you can get out of the particular web API? Okay, so but basically yes.
Basically, after discovering your typhus.
Yeah. I don't know how to say it either. Typhus, I don't know.
Yeah. I was questioning the reason behind any API gem, because it just does.
Some people say that.
If you have an HTTP call,
yeah,
you just plug in, and also Rails provides the hash method to URL.
Yeah.
So you just stick in all the parameters in a beautiful Rails hash.
Right.
You do it to URL, you stick it into a typhus,
yeah,
and it gives you a nice response, and you can do whatever.
Right. Do people understand that point? Who saw the Typheus gem mentioned in some of the stuff that I showed you guys? I didn't highlight it. So basically, it's a gem that encapsulates and abstracts out the whole process of doing a REST request. And I think it just gives you back JSON, right? And then you can use another.
You can, like on the eBay API,
yeah,
in the request, you define the return type.
Yeah.
And so I just type in XML.
Yeah, XML, but whatever it is, you get the raw stuff, and then you have to do another step to parse it. But basically, Typheus is a very, and I researched it before I suggested it. Right now, it's the one to use. That's what people say is the best one. And it has the characteristic of allowing parallel requests, so you can get parallelism going. But the simplest part of it, and I think I'll show you this in a second, is simply that, my power is going down, is that you give it a URL and it gives you back a bunch of data.
Well, it makes some parsing, like it gives you a response object, and
yeah,
you can do things like, you can ask this object, is the response okay?
Right.
Was there a timeout? And it has all the data already stored in the object.
Yeah. So the point is good. I mean, so sometimes people basically feel that the value you get out of the gem, as much as anything, is the expertise of how to call the API. It's the details of what is available, because people maybe are kind of like the Wine API I showed you guys. If you look at it, it's very badly documented. It's very hard to tell really what it does. So there, if somebody did a wine.com gem, they would do the research and give you some more kind of like logical calls. So I would always start with looking for a gem, but then look closely whether I really want to use it. Sometimes it's good to get going, but quickly you end up doing your own stuff. Okay, so let's go a level deeper. Right. So let's say I wanted to make a web service, a fortune cookie web service. This web service has a URL that says /get fortune, and it returned me my fortune for the day. Right. So what would that look? Tell me about how you would. Let's say that existed.
I'm pretty sure it does exist.
Okay, even better. How would it work? Talk a little bit. Talk it through. Give what I said.
So I would imagine you would have to go and like get the fortune from some place.
Yeah.
Some API or whatever, they have like a list of fortunes.
Yeah.
They have like a get random kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure.
Yeah. Anybody want to add to that? Let's say I wanted to implement a fortune. Well, first of all, let's say it existed, and I wanted to use it. How would I use it? Just give it a little scenario. Tell a little story. I'm telling you this API exists. I'm telling you use it. How would you use it? What were the steps you would go through? Maybe the question is not clear.
What are the licensing terms?
Okay, but how would you do technically? Like make an app. What would you do? Yes.
With the documentation.
Say what?
Go with the documentation.
Yeah, go on. I'm not asking something too deep. I just want to help you have you think it through technically.
Get a key.
Yeah. And then you would take that URL, plug it into an app like Typheus, a gem like Typheus. It would return to you something. You'd have to know what the format is of the thing you're returning. It could just be a text string, right? Or it could be XML, or it could be JSON, or it could be any number of things. In practice, it would be probably JSON. And that's basically it. Now, you were starting to describe how you would implement it. So now let's say you wanted to be you're the implementer. You want to create the service. You would create like a Rails server, right? And I'll show you at the end how to do this. And it would have just one action and one route, and the route would be / get fortune to start. And in the action, it would just return that string. And that's how you would implement it. It would look it up in a database because you've collected the world's biggest list of fortunes. You'd pick a random record. It would give you a string, and you would return that. So that's really what it is. Okay? So, okay, I'm going to go fast because we've done this before. But because REST is talking about HTTP, we have the series of verbs like before. And part of the documentation is just to explain what verb you use. It's generally going to be a get. Give me an example, anybody, of a web service where you would not use a get. Invent a web service where you would not use a get. I actually posted a link to one. Anybody? Yes.
I think the Reddit one you might have been able to post.
Yeah, but there's one like go ahead.
Make a bid on an eBay item.
Yeah, there's one that I posted how to send a text message. Right, so there's a lot of interesting APIs that do something. So you have to pick the right. HTTP verb. You have to then design your URL, try to make it something that's sensible, and then we talked about caching. Okay, so this is this point I'm touching on here. I'm glad I reminded myself. One of the things about REST that led to it, I think anyway, was the need to have a strict relationship between the path of the URL and the value returned. One of the things about GET, the rules for GET within REST and within HTTP is if I get the same URL twice, I should get the same value, right? And people call that, anybody hear the buzzword for that? Idempotent. It's just a show-off word. It just means if I get the same path, I should get the same value. And that's one of the principles of REST. And the reason that's a useful principle is because that allows you to safely cache in the network the results. If everybody on the planet is doing get the temperature in the city of Boston, and some people are in Australia, and some people are in Russia, and some people are in Boston, then it's possible to have a caching service in the network which sees that I know this URL, it's get temperature in zip code 02345, and return the value without ever hitting the REST service. So one of the things that REST did, one of the goals of REST was a single URL with a get should return the same thing, the same number. Modulo, of course, cache timeouts. Okay? So.
How do you deal with this random?
Pardon me?
How do you deal with an URL?
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, that's as I was saying that, I was thinking about this particular case here, and does that violate REST because it returns something random every time? I don't know.
So that you use not get or something else?
Right, I might do that. I mean, I would just do a little research to see what the right thing is. I mean, if you could say, like, what if I had a web service that generated a random number, right? What is the official REST way to do it? It could be one of these edge cases that they don't really properly account for. Like somebody was discussing on Piazza whether a session violated REST, because a session is, again, information that's carried from, yeah. And I think it's a good question. Okay. Pardon?
So you should use caching for the random number one. Generates a random number for like a minute. And then,
well, that's the thing.
Then a new random number.
Yeah, that's the thing, yes.
If it's just a separate thing that sends you to a random RESTful URL,
right,
is that actually a distinct thing? Like if random just creates a number and then redirects me to that number, right, which is in itself a RESTful URL, that doesn't actually seem like random. I guess, I mean, the way I'm thinking about having it implemented, wouldn't actually include random being part of the service, but actually just being a function that sends you to another part of the service.
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
Well, is random supposed to be a thing on it in itself, or is it supposed to just direct you to a separate call to a number?
Well, and the separate call would be another URL?
Right.
Well, then you would, but then I would ask the question about that URL. Does that one rest? That's just one step away. So if I wanted to have, pedoserver.com/getrandom, and it returns basically JSON for a random number, right? You're saying, no, let it return, instead of that, another URL, which gives me a random number. Is that what you're saying?
No.
Okay, what are you saying then? William?
Yeah, so like with the fortune, so it will call the random action, and that random will generate like a random ID, for example. So it will return fortune/1. Or
Yeah.
So,
sure.
And that one is
right.
legitimate.
Yeah, that one's always.
That goes into the question of what you say your service does. If I say my service does, every time I call it, it gives me a new random string, then the number of the random of the fortune would not appear in the URL. It would just be get me a fortune. Right. Yeah. And if it was get me fortune number 41, and I generated 41 on my side, then you're fine, because now 41 is always the same thing. And it's very easy if you read the blogs and you follow this stuff. It's very easy to get sort of caught up in some of these religious arguments. And there are definitely edge cases like this. And basically, my approach is not to get involved in that. And try to focus on the big principles. Another principle that's interesting that I want to quickly touch on in terms of web service design. And this is new for me. I only learned this as I was researching this over the last few weeks. Is that it is believed that it is bad design to include in your web service URL numbers which correspond to record numbers. In other words, this is considered to be bad design. A URL that looks like this. Contact 450, which oddly enough is what you get for free from Rails. In other words, the current latest thinking about designing web services is that the kind of URLs you get and the kind of web services you get almost for free from Rails are actually not the best design. That's one thing. The second thing, and then I'll come back and pull them together, that people that think about these things are saying now, is that it's also not good web service design to have it return. Let me give you a specific example. Let's say my contact service included a person's name, one or more email addresses, and one or more phone numbers, right? And let's say that in the database in my system, I represented that with two one-to-many relationships. One person has many addresses, and one person has many phone numbers. And let's say because of that, my temptation would be to say, if you want to find all of Peter's contact information, you would first find his number, his information here, and then you would do contact 415 phones, let's say, and then you would also do boom boom / addresses. In other words, first of all, you're exposing the record number, and second of all, to find out everything you want to know about Peter's contact information, you have to make 3 calls. This is also considered a bad design. Anytime, and that has to do with what one of you said, which is too much granularity. Every little thing requires a call. What is considered to be better design, and not that you're going to apply this right away, you may or may not apply it right away, it doesn't matter to me that much, but in terms of the sort of best practice, is that you actually have a web service which is, the URLs are different and are meaningful for their own use. So in other words, instead of saying contact 415, I would say I would have a contact question mark, let's say name equals Peter Salas. Therefore, I'm not putting 415 in my URL. And it would return a compound JSON structure that included both my fixed information, name, first name, last name, and so on, but then have a nested thing for each of the phone numbers. So phone 1, 2, and 3, and another nested thing for the addresses. And that this whole thing was returned as a result of that call. You guys follow? Yes, George.
Then you need to make sure that the name is unique.
Well, don't focus. You probably have a number of ways of identifying the right person.
Well,
my point is
still, like whatever you use there,
it has to be unique.
Make sure that
yes.
it's unique.
But it could be a badge number. It could be something that's real world versus your record number.
Yeah, but it's like it will still be uniquely mapped to this record, and so then where's the difference to the record number?
The difference is that
Not revealing your
you're not using it as part of the URL.
Sorry.
You're not using it as part of the URL. The client to your web service never sees those numbers. They see numbers which have some outside meaning. For instance, if it's a license plate or a badge number, or even if it's a GUID. Okay? I saw another hand. Yes, bro.
So, are we hiding the 415 from the public? Or
Yeah. Yes.
Are we like disguising it as like something else?
You're never disguising it. In other words, it's never part of the URL. And by the way, I can make a less strong case about that part than I can about the nesting structure. Okay? The part about not using the outside database numbers, I've seen it mentioned many times, but I haven't quite seen the powerful justification. I have seen the powerful justification for uncoupling your web services document, let's say the payload that the web services return, from a direct correspondence to your relational database schemas. Because that's just too limiting, and people that use these things and build it into large-scale, real-world systems find that that's a recipe for trouble. I saw another hand, I thought. Yes?
I'm a little bit confused about the URLs.
Yeah.
Like, okay, like the one you used to raise for you, so it was contacts, that's 451.
Yeah.
And so you were saying that is not good form.
Right.
But what about what we were just talking about, fortune/1 or whatever? I thought the whole idea was a URL has one.
It does. The key that I was talking about is not that you have a number or some unique thing, but that number is derived strictly from the unique key of that record in the database.
But I feel like everything we've been doing with sort of RESTful design of things like users/index.
Yes.
Blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So
I'm
you're saying all of that is bad.
I'm saying, in terms of best practices, we're doing the shortest script between A and B, but in terms of best practices, less so probably for the web pages than it is for the APIs.
Right.
In terms of best practices, and I'll come back, I'm going to do a little more digging to give you a stronger argument. My first argument was that it's too tied to the record numbers, which is an implementation detail. It might have to do also with the resilience of the URL. In other words, if I dump and reload the database, the unique keys might change, versus something that we know is uniquely identified in Peter's house forever. And that could be a badge number, it could be just a GUID that's part of the data structure. Okay, but you're right, absolutely right. I have been doing all the examples up to now with record numbers here. But realize that the record numbers, that's an implementation detail. There's nothing about the URL or about the person typing it into the browser, because they never type those numbers, that says it's got to be a record number. It's just because the way we implement the controllers, that we get the :ID or the params ID, and we turn around and just do a active record dot find of this ID, that's where we're creating that dependency. If this ID instead was this, let's say, serial number or a badge number, then I would just do a select where badge number is that, and we'd be fine. The outside world doesn't know that that number is an ID. But I agree with a little bit of the skepticism, which is like, I don't really have a powerful argument, but I'm going to find it. Anybody else a little vague on this stuff, or are you basically following me? Okay. Everybody? Okay, good. All right. So you guys looked at programmable web. If you haven't, look at it. It's not authoritative. You'll find things which are not on there, et cetera, et cetera. But the mindset I want you to have is, as you're designing your product or a product in the future, is to realize that you can greatly make greatly augment the feature set you deliver if you keep in mind that there's data sets for all this stuff out there, and just about anything, even Wikipedia, just about anything you want data for, there's a web service out there. And by the way, as I was talking about my friend with the app, if you yourself are building a unique data set, like Vaporator is, then that's actually a major asset that you might elect to put behind a web service and then end up discovering that that's your most valuable assets. Because you get everybody to use the site for free and they're very, very happy. But in fact, what you're doing is generating this big database of data. In fact, I just remember just coming in here earlier today, I saw an article, I got a link from somebody who's building, I haven't even looked at it yet, but who's building an edutech app having to do with classrooms and courses and so on, making it free for users, students and teachers, because their business model was collecting information about classes that in turn they were going to sell for research. So the whole thing is a fake, not fake, but they're like, it's like Google. You use Google for free, but really what they're doing is they know everything you do and they're selling that. So sometimes the data you generate as part of your app is the big thing, and building the web service to let people pay for accessing it is the key to your business model. Okay. So, let's take a look at some of the code that I have in here. I didn't even give you the link to it. I must have given it to you. No, did I forget? Oh, here we go. Yes. Okay. Okay. So we're going to start one thing at a time. So basically this is the most simple case, and I'm using Ruby here, but this stuff would work very similarly with any number of languages. But here I'm using a gem called Yahoo Weatherman. I had to look at the example code they provide, and I'm writing these few lines. So I say client equals Weatherman colon client new, which is a very typical structure because that creates the context. And then I just call lookup by location, and I find all these things. Now I had a lot of problems with this because, let me do a bundle. I thought I'd run this here. Okay, what's wrong here?
It can't load.
I know. Maybe I have to exit here and do subble from here. I bet that's what it is. I hope that's what it is. No.
Why did you use teachback?
I'll show you.
Huh?
What?
Why did you call your folder teachback?
Because it's an example having to do with teachback. This is annoying. Let me see here. Cannot load file Yahoo Weatherman. It's not really teachback. I just used that name. Yahoo Weatherman is there. Try again. If this doesn't work, I'm going to go to the command line. Oh, good. Seems like it's going to work. Yes, good. Okay, so taking you through this, it's very simple. It's nothing very deep here. I found by looking at the Weatherman documentation that gem that there was a call called lookup by location. I discovered that it was 02474. Now look at that, forecast bracket 0 bracket high. You know, I had to reverse engineer that, which is very typical. The documentation was not really good to explain that lookup by location would return an array. This is getting very mechanical. It just shows you the problems you hit. So what I had to do was basically the thought process went something like this. I would just go, okay, let me try this first. Run it. And I got, oh, okay, I see here, this is a JSON structure. And I noticed that.
That's over the next bunch of days.
Pardon me?
It's for the next few days.
Right, exactly. Day, Tuesday, Wednesday. It says now I guessed, because this is just purely a matter of the way this particular method in this particular gem is implemented, that I could just do, and I guessed, an index to get a particular day, and then I ran it again. And now I saw that I had a certain day. And then I went actually to the documentation, the code itself, and I discovered that I can just say low, and I first tried this, and I don't think it worked. And then I said, okay, let me try this. And I'm showing you this to say to you that when you use a gem, it's very nice, but often you get caught up in these stupid little details, and you have to sort them out. Yes?
So here the difference was that you try to access a hash, right?
Yeah.
And like it looked, but you said it's a JSON. So how do you would do a
well, remember, JSON looks a lot like the constant notation in Ruby for a hash. But it doesn't follow necessarily that that's how they would choose to do it. They could have just said, forecasts, bracket Monday, bracket low. They could have just returned all of them. I mean, there were a lot of possibilities, and it was just a matter of playing around. And really, I don't want to get caught up in this particular API, just the notion that, expect these things to not work just the first time you try them. Expect to do a little messing around. Okay? Let me see what order I want to go in. So now my next experiment was, let's see. Oh, this I've done before. This is the conversion from XML to JSON. I won't have to do it again. So then I said, okay, I did a little bit more research, and I found this gem called Typhoeus. What does that mean? Anybody know? Yes?
It's like Greek mythology.
Uh-huh.
Like serpents.
A multi-headed serpent or something? Because it does have the feature of being able to initiate multiple HTTP requests together.
This is called Hydra.
Uh-huh.
And Hydra is a big Greek ancient.
And is Typhoeus the Roman equivalent or something? I don't know, whatever.
Typhoeus is like Hercules, but the one who defeated the Hydra.
The deadliest monster of Greek mythology, the last son of Gaia.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so then I went to, okay, let's go. I did the research and found that this is, people say what I think George said, which is, what's the point of these gems anyway? There's so little work to do it directly. So then I found Typhoeus. Now let's quickly look at the Typhoeus documentation to see what I had to work with. Something like that. Oh, I got it. So Ruby Gems is the collection of all gems in the universe. Oh, power! And I generally just go to the documentation, or to the homepage rather. And these things are often very well documented, and you just see all the little code samples. I often try the code samples to see whether I understand how it works. And you can just read it. It's got everything you need to know. In our case, this is a very simple example. I didn't need anything fancy. So let's go back and say, all right. So I did a Typhoeus get. And again, in the spirit of debugging, I said, okay, let me just do a put s of result here to see what I got. Yeah, let's just do that to see what happens. And I started here, and I saw this is just an object. It's not very interesting. So this is the result of this is just an object. It's a Typhoeus response object. So I said, okay, let's do an inspect on it. See if we get any more. Yes, we do, but it's illegible. Then I looked into the documentation. I saw that what I can find out is the response body, which is one of the different parts of one of the different methods on the Typhoeus object. So I said, okay, and so I took a look at that. Now I got XML, that's this here, right? And we all know what XML looks like, a lot of angle brackets and stuff. And we can see by reading this, all the bits are in here. Then the next thing I did was I found the popular gem called XML Simple to parse that. And that was the next step. And that's this line here, very, very simple. XML Simple. This is, by the way, this kind of method is called what in Ruby language? It's a certain kind of method. It's not an instance method, but it's it's louder. I didn't hear it.
Class method.
Okay, what is the class method? Right? And how do you define one? David, how do you define one?
So.
Pardon? I'd ask David.
Oh, I'm sorry.
How do you define a class method?
Yeah.
The class.
What's the syntax? Do you know?
No, I don't think so.
Have you ever used one? Yeah. Go ahead. One thing. Let us hear it.
Self dot.
Right. Exactly. A little bit of Ruby just to spice it up. So basically, I sit around. I can do it here. Class point, and I can say here, def, for example, set x, blah blah blah, end, or I can say def self dot pi, which returns 3.1415. Okay? That is a regular method, can only be called against an instance of point. That is a class method and can be called directly by saying point dot pi. Got it? By the way, it's also legal to do this. Def point dot whatever, pi, and end. These two are equivalent. This one's a little better, because if you ever change the name of the class, you don't have to change this. I'm sorry?
Can you do def point outside of the class point?
That's a good question. This one not.
Yeah.
This one maybe. Maybe, I'm not sure.
So I guess is this the way how Rails adds methods to my object?
No, it uses complicated meta coding, class eval and stuff like that. Yes.
Can you still have an initialize method?
Of course. Yeah. But it'll never be called in this case.
It will not be called with the class methods?
The initial, no, it does not, because you never create an instance of point. This is it's almost like a global method by itself.
What about to use set x?
I'm sorry?
To use set x? When you have to have an instance of point
to do set x, yes, absolutely, yes, because this is always, you have to do point.new, and then x equals point.new, x dot set x, yes. Class methods can be called against a class, do not require an instance to have been created. Regular methods do require an instance to be created, and while we're on this little side trip, if I say at a center equals 0 versus I say at center equals 0, the fact that this at center equals 0 is inside of a class method makes this instance variable a class instance variable bound to the class and not to a particular instance. The fact that this at center equals 0 is part of a regular or instance method means that this at center equals 0 is creating an instance variable for that instance.
So when you say at center equals 0, does that mean if you create an instance of that object, by default it'll have center 0?
No.
Okay.
It means that if I have another class method, it would find that to be 0.
Okay.
So you might imagine, and that, by the way, remember early on I said do not do at. Foo. This is called technically, I don't even know what it's technically called. I think it's technically called a class instance method. This is called a regular instance method, and this is called a class method. This is the one that's buggy. This serves more or less the same purpose. Imagine a simple example. I want to have a count of how many points I create total. I can just, every time I do I can have a method that's called count another point or something like that, which increments the number, and I call that an initializer, and then every time somebody creates a new point, it adds one to it. And now I have a way to have a count of the total number of points. That's one very vanilla way to use it. Yeah?
But if you do that, you need a count as a class attribute.
Correct.
How do you define that? Other than just add f?
No, this is how you would do it. It would be at count equals 0 here. Well, what I would do is I would say if it's nil, set it to 0. If it's not nil, set it to 1. Otherwise, increment it. I would do something like that.
Yeah, sure. But if you want to increment it, you have to access it, and you will access it on a class instance.
Right.
On a class object.
Yep.
So you have to define a class object attribute.
No, you don't. This is creating a class. We'll do some experimenting. This and this do very, very similar things, but this one is better behaved. This one is ill behaved under certain circumstances. It's kind of considered to be a bug in the language.
Isn't this creating just an instance attribute?
No, this is creating a class level instance variable, i.e. an instance variable tied to this, because it's in a class method.
Oh. If I would
Okay, let's not. We'll do it offline. Let's go to the next one. Now here I'm saying now I'm pretending to be trade assistant, and I want to be able to ask for the price of a security all the time, and so I'm going to run it. This one I structured as a test. So what I wrote in my test was, because this is how I do TDD. If it's something very small, I put it in the same file. And I say describe, my thing is called a security base, which is a security database. And I said it could return the price of Google. And I said security base, this is a class method. That price for Google must be greater than 0. I also said security base price for Google better be different than the price for Apple, won't equal 0. And I also said if I ask it for the name of a certain security, it's going to give me the name. Those are my tests. And you see when I ran it, that they all ran, as you can see down here. Well, it's down there, 0. Let's look at the code. So the code is, notice a few things here, exactly what I was just talking about. There's 3 class methods here. Okay? And the interesting one, I'm doing exactly what I was just talking about. I have a method called memoize XML. Memoizing is an architecture term, which means making a method remember the last value it returned so you don't have to compute it again. It's kind of a method level cache, and people use the shorthand calling it memoizing, have it make a memo. Okay? So memoize XML for a certain security name. And I ask at XML cache, that's a class variable because it's inside of a class method. If it's nil, set it to an empty hash. And then I say, hey, do you know, is there anything in the cache for the security name? If that's nil, I call Typheus with the URL. This is %secname, substitute secname is there. Grab the response body, and I store it in the variable XML. And then I say to my cache, create a new entry with the key of the security name and assign XML. So now I've memoized for a certain security, I've memoized what the XML return is. And then the value returns XML. So when I ask for a price, I call self-memoize of XML with the security name. One way or the other, I get the XML, I parse it, and I return that. This way, if I call the same thing twice, I'm going to get, it's going to pick it up out of the cache. Okay? If I ask for the name, similarly here. Okay? So my tests are the way they are. Why do you think I have this test, this funny little test here? This test here. What was I testing? Yeah.
Make sure you didn't always get the same number.
Yeah, exactly. I was testing my cache. It's obviously a very incomplete test, but it gave me enough to say I'm willing to show you guys the code.
And if you have that, like in Google and Apple have the same stuff.
That's the end of that's basically the end of the world.
Okay.
Because Google is like 1,500, Apple's at 600, 500. So anyway, so that's a use case of how to access. So I basically not using a gem. I'm using Typheus. I'm using XML Simple. I'm building a little wrapper to memoize the data and hide the rest of my app from any knowledge of how this API works. Yeah?
Oh, on the XML cache check, I was wondering if there was a reason you didn't use the or equals, like if there was like some.
No, there was no reason. I think it would have worked. But yes, she's saying it would have worked. I don't know. I've never really, to be honest, got super comfortable with that. I'm always a little confused because some edge cases where it doesn't work correctly, I'd like to make it explicit, but there's no real reason. The other thing you might ask is, why did I not put the conversion from XML, into the common method? Why do I have, this is obviously, I'm repeating myself, XML in, XML in. So that's questionable. I would refactor that. There's really no reason why I should be doing that. But anyway, so that's a simple case, but it shows you the example. You have an API, you wrap it in an object, you memorize it, and then the rest of your app doesn't know how the hell the thing works. Last thing, really quickly, to satisfy William's concern, how would you create a web service is the next question I want to show you. And, no. Hey, come on. All right. Oh, I know, it's another window. So how do you create a web service? Well, it's very simple, right? I want to, yep, okay, I covered that before. I'm just going to show you the code. We only have a few minutes left. So let's say that Teachback wanted to provide an API that allowed any course, let me just leave it here for a second, to talk to the server, any other app to talk to the server and find out information about the course called AAA. How would you implement that if you wanted to provide that web service? Or anybody else on the Teachback team? How would you implement that? You want your Teachback server to provide, to be the host of a web service. Anybody?
Create an API, I guess.
But technically, this is your homework. How would you do it? Where would you go? Yeah, wait, not George. Anybody else? Anybody else? How would you do it? Okay, George.
For my first, maybe naive approach would be to stick in the data I want to return to a certain API call into the ERB.
Yeah, but you would start earlier. There's a new URL that I want my server to obey, right? So what do you do when you need a URL?
Yeah,
you add a route.
New routes, new controller,
right.
New view.
So what I did was I went to routes and I added 3 gets. API course info, API school info, API lecture info. So now my URLs look like that. API / a word. Cool. Now I have to add a controller called, what's the controller called?
API.
API controller, right? So let's look at that. You're going to be, oh, is that all? There's API controller. Okay, so I just build the result I want. In this case, I would be querying the database. I wouldn't be putting content. I would do database calls to query the information I want, and then I would return it either as JSON or as XML. And that's it. It's so simple. So it's a piece of cake. The difficulty, like building a web server, like building any system, is to decide on the API, decide on the formats, decide on the structure of the URL. Did you follow this? Yeah? Who follows this? Who's totally thrown by this? Anybody totally mixed up? I want to run Teachback right now. Confused? Confused. Okay, I'm going to do it one more time. Give me 1 minute, okay? Basically, a web service responds to an API, to a URL. So whenever I want my web server to present an API, I have to handle a URL. I designed the URL. I put it in my routes. So I've created 3 URLs. So it's Teachback /API /course info, Teachback /API /school info, and so on, lecture info. And in Rails, in the particular case of the get, that means that it's a controller, because controllers are what respond to APIs always. It's called the API controller. So there's 3 actions on it. If we look at the API controller, I think I may actually only have built 1. No, there's the other 2. So there's 3 actions, 1, 2, 3. If I do Teachback /course info, it's going to call this method. The first thing I'd say is, if there's no course in params, that's a problem. Give an error. Otherwise, I construct the result by actually accessing my database. Here I'm just doing it in constants as a hash. This is just a regular hash. And then this construct here says respond not with HTML, but with either JSON or XML, depending on what the user asked for. And then you use render, this is just the way it's done, indicating the data type, the result is this, and it converts it and generates the proper XML or JSON. And this is extraordinary, it's surprisingly simple, right?
So when I try, like, if I go to on the web, if you run a Rails server,
Yeah.
Does it return does it just print out that string?
Let's just do it real quick. You guys can start packing up. I'll do it here.
Or like what happens to like curl?
Yeah. So if I go 0.0.0 / API / course info, did I spell it wrong? Info. Okay, thank you.
API, you said API.
Oh, that's 2 mistakes.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, that's the same. Really nuisance last time.
No.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, you need a parameter.
Oh, right, of course.
I mean, I think that was,
Course equals COSI 236b. And now I have to do .json. And now I get it. Okay, .xml. I can't do it in a hurry, but it worked at home. But that's the basic concept.
That's good. It's quick and dirty.